All right. Well, hey everyone, and welcome back to another Learning Tech Talks, where we are continuing to help keep you future focused as we explore the landscape of business, technology, and the human experience. Today, I'm actually talking with Rob Eschmann, who is the Associate Professor of Social Work at Columbia University, as well as the author of the book, When the Hood Comes Off, Racism and Resistance in the Digital Era. And we're going to be talking about how technology is changing the experience with racism, which is a really important conversation as we think about what does that actually look like and how is it changing as technology is evolving, as well as how is that evolving in the national conversation that we're having. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I think it's a very timely one and one I've been waiting for quite some time, Rob. So thanks so much for making the time and joining me.
Oh, of course. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to, us being able to have this conversation.
Yeah, and I forget. I should know this. You would think I would just know this off the top of my head. But where is Columbia University?
It's in New York. So we're
It's in
right
New
in New
York.
York
Okay.
City, in Harlem, or a neighborhood called Morningside Heights.
Okay. All right. But you have, I don't know if you saw that, but I have the new Apple OS and randomly, like now it picks up on my gestures. So you may randomly see things like this happen while I'm doing it. And for those of you who are listening, go watch the video and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about.
That's fun. Does it
Uh,
work for me too? Or no, I don't have
it
the same
doesn't work for
privileges.
you. It only works for, I know it's pretty cool, but it's always embarrassing in meetings when it pops up. But you were in Chicago. I feel like you have some Chicago background, don't you?
Oh yeah, I was born and raised in Chicago, graduated from, high school from Chicago Public Schools. I got my master's and PhD from the University of Chicago. And so I
Okay.
lived in Chicago
All
my
right.
whole
So you're
life.
in New York, but you got the
Yeah,
Midwestern roots.
that's
All
right.
right. All
That's right.
right.
Yeah.
So, for those who may not know who you are, I'd love just a little bit of background because obviously you went into the academia around social work and you've written a book on the impact of technology on racism, but that doesn't just happen out of nowhere. So,
Mm.
what is the backstory of you, Rob, and kind of the journey you've been on?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. So, I think that for me, the reason I went to grad school is I wanted to be a scholar of education reform. I wanted to,
Okay.
right. I think that early on, I read a book called Savage Inequalities by Jonathan Kozol that talked about or made a connection between inequality in education and then inequality in other life outcomes, from employment to
Okay.
incarceration rates. And so from that, I think I
So you saw
saw.
the connection between education and how that placed an outcome or how people's lives ended up playing out and seeing the criticality of it. So that just immediately was a main point of focus for you.
Yeah, yeah, that's right, that's right. And so I wanted to go to grad school. Where I think I was a English lit major for a while, and wanted to be a high school teacher. Just wanted to be involved in education and trying to
Okay.
be a part of the solution to the problem of educational inequality. And then at some point, I realized, maybe it was taking some sociology classes, I might prefer to do research, and instead of just working in one high school classroom, to think about the issues more broadly and be part of bigger reform efforts. So that's what
Okay.
drove me to grad school. I mostly applied to sociology programs, and the way I ended up in social work is, Charles Payne was my mentor. He wrote a book called So Much Reform, So Little Change, which was really an overview of different reform efforts over the decades and why they failed. And Charles was in the middle of doing a project in Chicago where his research was being used to actually create, a reform effort. And so the Woodlawn Children's Promise Community was a replication of the Harlem Children's Zone that really saw school reform as being connected from, birth and or before birth, giving mothers access to kind of prenatal, social services, and then all the way up through college, and giving kids access to mentors even after they graduate high school. And so I wanted to be a part of this comprehensive school reform effort. And I love the idea that in social work, it's valued that research does not just have to live in the ivory tower. It's not just about academia, but that we want to do research that has real world impact. And so I wanted
Okay.
to be a part of that project, and that's what brought me to U Chicago, in the School of Social Work. And since then, I've really developed an identity as a social worker, and I love the discipline. So for me, to answer your question, right? So I came to grad school in order to understand, you know, educational inequality, which is one form, right, of
And it
racial
sounds like it
inequality.
also was rooted in a desire to do something bigger than, I mean, obviously to me, there's still value in, absolutely. I mean, I have an education background, and mad props to all the teachers who are in the trenches going, I want to be a part of the solution in that capacity. Mad
Hmm.
props to them. I think it's a huge calling. But for you, you said, I love this, but I want to do more. Is that really that driving factor?
That's right. That's right. I
Okay.
wanted to be I wanted to understand the problem more, and I wanted to be a part of the solution. And for me, being a part of the solution and finding the right solution needed to be, needed to start with kind of having a more complex understanding of the problem.
Okay.
And so, right, really, education inequality is one form of anti-Black oppression, and that's something that I see all of my work as being about understanding and highlighting the mechanisms of racism and then figuring out how to fix those things. And so, that's why I'm in grad school. But my
Okay.
first semester, first quarter in grad school, I took a class on racism. And one of the books we read was Eduardo Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racists. And it's about colorblind racism and the way that racism has become more subtle since the ending of Jim Crow, or since the classic
Okay.
years of the civil rights movement, right? That whereas racism was the law of the land, people were open about their racism before the civil rights movement. Nowadays, it's illegal to discriminate, and racism tends to be more subtle.
Okay.
And I think that it's a great framework for understanding how, in most mainstream spaces, the expressions of racism have changed. That we experience
Okay.
explicitly racist things much less often. Things like microaggressions or racial slights are more the common way that we experience racism on a daily basis, right? But
So
I,
is unpacking kind of that macro shift societally about how that has changed?
Exactly, right? Well, it's a great book I still reference, but I remember reading it and thinking, "Huh, this is a little bit different than how I have experienced racism online." Right? And I I opened my book talking about the first time that I was called the N-word was when just playing video games online. The first time I played video games online, the first, thing I said into the microphone, someone called me the N-word. And it's not something I had experienced,
Really?
right? Growing up in a predominantly, right, Black and Latinx neighborhood, folks didn't throw around the N-word maliciously like that, right? And so,
Yeah, and
you
that's not
know,
something you probably typically would encounter out, walking the shopping mall or doing something like that. It's not going to be something you typically encounter, and your first encounter online is boom, like right in your face.
yeah, yeah. And right, that's my first encounter, but then all the encounters after that ended the
Yeah.
same way. And I think, right, it's funny, this weekend actually, there's some guys that I play video games with, and one of the cousins who I mentioned in that chapter, and we're busy and we haven't played in a long time, but we happen to have a gaming reunion this weekend. And my friends were talking about how we all have these kind of banners where if you donate a little bit of money to the movement for Black Lives, they give you like an in-game reward that shows up under your username.
Oh,
And
okay.
by going into games with this very movement for Black Lives oriented banner under your name, that you will get racial hate from people sending you message to, with all kind of, racial slurs that sneak past the moderation, that it's still happening today. And so I think for me as a gamer, as me being someone who spent time online and seeing racist comments under YouTube videos, seeing racist videos online, I just knew that racism was not subtle everywhere. And it just made me want
Okay.
to think about, okay, if this is the dominant, right, this is the kind of the leading theory suggests that the dominant forms of racism is to be more subtle. How do we make sense of that with the fact that online that is not the rule, right? It's a
Yeah.
little bit, we have a little bit
Yeah, there was a
uh
total cognitive disconnect between the two. Of, well,
ex-
this is really, in one sense, it's being presented. This is actually how it is. And then on the other side, you're going, well, but maybe that's true in certain sections or segments. Yet over here, it is very much not changed whatsoever.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, no, exactly. And so that, I didn't start the project then, but I started thinking about it then. I started reading about online, communication or computer mediated communication, and what is distinct about talking online versus in person. How can we explain this big difference between, the ways that conversations about race go in face-to-face settings versus in online settings. And I just kind of kept that as a side project, reading on my own, building expertise, and not really knowing when I was going to go back and study it. I think I kind of had it in the back of my head I was
It's
going
like
to
a
do. Yeah,
it's like a side hustle where you're like, this is really important to me because as you're going through all this, I'm experiencing all this, but at the time you didn't really know what you were going to do with it.
I did it. And, because I mentioned I wrote up a little mini proposal where I wanted to just quantify the percentage of people that I played with on Xbox who were going to use the N word in the lobby. And I brought that to a professor who told me, like, you don't want to be known as the video games guy. Don't do that project. And so, I just keep reading about it on my own. In my head, I'm like, look, once I get tenure, then I can do what I want. And then I'm going to go back and do this project. Right.
As you're waiting for tenure, like, trust me, you do not want to be the video guy's racism, dude.
Yeah.
Just don't do it. So you're like, all right, I'll put it on the back burner.
Yeah, yeah. But I realized that the field was starting. Yeah, so I think the question was ahead of where my field was at that time. But I
Yeah.
realized that field was starting to accept research like that when I got involved with a project where we looked at the effects of online communication on community violence, and that work was really well received. And that just kind of inspired me that no, now is the time that people are beginning to recognize that if you're concerned with young people, you have to understand their
Yeah.
the role that technology plays in their lives. And I think that that is something that is almost universally understood now, that in any study, even if it's not tech focused, you have to have a question at least where you're talking to youth about their experiences online and how it intersects with the other questions that you're asking. And so I think that gave me confidence to be able to
Okay.
begin this study. And then where the study actually began, right, this is 8 years. I have interviews with 85 students in 5 different cities: Los Angeles, Chicago,
An
Atlanta,
8-year
New
study.
York, Boston. Yeah, and right, it took me a long time, but the project started when there was a campus where there was a website that allowed students to post anonymous comments in order to
Uh,
generate conversations about issues that they may not feel comfortable discussing in their everyday lives. And
okay.
so it's supposed to be, right, not a racist place, but just a place for open discussion. But it turned into some place that just had the reputation of being horribly racist and homophobic, and that's how students talked about it. And those are the messages that were there. And something that was unique about the site, right? I think that we're used to seeing, unfortunately, we're used to seeing racism in the YouTube comments. We're used to hearing racism when you play video games, but we're
Yeah,
not.
in many ways, it's almost kind of dismiss my experience because I grew up around gaming and all this other stuff was it's almost, and I think this goes back to a point you just brought up, which is there was almost like this view that digital or technological things, it was like a silo. We didn't really think about it as the real world. It's like, yeah, it
Mhm.
happens over there, but it's not real. It's
Exactly.
digital. It's some other worldly thing. It's not really part of our human experience. It's this other thing. And to your point, I think it's often just, it's ignored. Ah, well, we see this in the YouTube comments. That's just what happens in the YouTube comments. Or we see this when you go into Xbox Live and you're doing stuff. And yeah, that's just how it is but we don't recognize it's like, no, that is actually the human experience. That is the real world. And I think there's been greater recognition that those two are integrated. But I would agree. I don't think we're there yet by any means.
Yeah, yeah, and no, you're exactly right. And the thing that made this website distinct was that you had to be a student in order to post to it. That moderators would anonymize the comments, but you had to be a student to be a part of this conversation. So it meant that instead of these messages just being the backdrop of the internet, like some ugly graffiti on a train, right, that you don't think too much about, it's just
Yeah.
there. You're realizing,
You're
oh,
like,
these are my
these
peers.
are kids in our school that are
Exactly.
saying and thinking these things. So we can't just kind of dismiss it and go, ah, well, whatever. This is probably some random person somewhere else on the planet.
Exactly. And for right, so for students of color who were having a great time on campus, now all of it, right, they're thinking that, oh, right, there are some students I interviewed who said that they thought that because everyone was an intellectual at this school, that they were beyond the race problem. And the website was the first time they realized that's not the case. That there are a lot of people here who think as if it were the 1950s. And that was scary for them, and not being able to pinpoint it. That you're in a dining hall sitting next to somebody and you don't know whether they posted.
I was going to
uh,
say, in some ways, I could see how that would actually escalate your anxiety about it because now you don't really know who it is, even. You know it's here, but because it's completely anonymized, yet not anonymized, because it's a student, you just don't know
Mhm.
which student, you can't necessarily pinpoint, oh, that's who it is. Like that's the you're like, well, it could be anybody everywhere now.
Exactly. Exactly. It's not like, oh, this person says problematic things and I don't want to be around them. There's no way of knowing. It could be right that students told me it could have been some of my friends who were happy and nice to my face who went to say these ugly things online and I just didn't know. And that changed the way that they felt about, some interracial friendships or felt about the institution and being a part of the school. And so like that is what really sparked this study was I wanted to talk to people in real life to understand real world. Right at the time, the research I was reading, most of the things that talked about race online only dealt with online data. That they're going
Okay.
to forums, they're looking at how people use social media or blogs, and I wanted to talk to people in the real world, face to face, about their experiences online and their experiences in person, and really try to understand the differences between how race, affected people's lives in different settings.
Well, and it also is interesting as you talk about this, because if the former data that was being looked at was just in the vacuum of, well, that's what the online data is saying, what you're missing from that is, right, but how is that affecting the human experience in that? Like we just talked about, the implications of you're now a student at this school. And now, I mean, I'm actually curious, as you had some of those conversations, what were some of the interesting findings that came out? Because I can only think psychologically and emotionally how that can affect things, even in terms of when you don't know who it is, that messes with your head big time in terms of, well, who do I trust? And maybe this person seems really nice over here, but are they really that way? Like, would they be the
Yeah.
same way if they were anonymized? What are they saying? I mean, that starts to do things with your head.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll give you three different examples of different
Okay.
ways that it could influence students. So one is the student who did not realize racism was a big deal. And right at this school, I only talk to students of color.
Mm.
So right there, I'm talking with Black students, Latinx students, Asian students about their experiences. One would be students were having a great time. Maybe they're in a white fraternity, and they don't see racism as being a big problem on campus. And then this happens, and now it's a wake up call for them. Like, oh, we're not past racism. I thought that this was a
So
school
you're
and a
cruising along, you're
context.
going about your life thinking, I came here, we're past this. This isn't part of the air that I breathe. And then bam, it hits you in the nose and you go,
Now
okay, I guess not.
you learn something about the world. You realize the world is not what you thought it was prior to seeing this website. Right? It's a huge change in worldview. Another scenario is going to be there's a student, a young Black woman who talked to me about, or she was very aware of racial microaggressions on campus.
Okay.
And when she would experience a racial microaggression, she could code someone as, oh, this person is racist. I don't want to be around them. And she could avoid them. But then with this website, with it being anonymous, she lost that coping mechanism of being able to identify and avoid racism and now felt
Okay.
helpless where now I can't avoid these people because I don't know who they are, and it could be anyone, and that bothered her, and not being able to have the same tools of navigating,
So the tools she
campus life.
had to cope and navigate, suddenly it was like, well, now I don't even know that I can. I mean, yes, you can still trust them in the instances you have, but now you're questioning, is that enough?
Exactly, exactly. And then I'll give you a third example of a young man who was Black and Latinx, biracial. And he talked about how he used the site as evidence that he would say to people who, when he was trying to convince them of the how real racism was, and they were more minimizing racism and not believing that it was as big
I
of an
mean,
issue as he
basically
made it.
gaslighting, going, you're
Exactly.
nuts. This isn't real. You're making this up.
And then he would say, "Hey, remember that stuff we were talking about that you said wasn't real? Here it is. Now this is
Yeah.
proof that it still exists, that it's on our campus." And right that now this person, although they were surprised and hurt by the site, they were also using the site as evidence to prove to people that racism is still a problem in society that we need to actively be concerned about in order to fix. And I think other students talked about that too, about how this was something that began to generate conversations about race that were, had a positive impact on the campus as people were no longer, being silent about race and racism, and instead recognizing, I know this is something that we have to deal with as a college community.
So, as you think about this, I'm curious because you obviously studied the academic implications as part of your graduate work and some of the education reform. I'm sure you saw no shortage of brokenness in the system. Then you start digging into the whole digital side of things. In many ways, your experience was kind of similar to some of the ones you just described to the students, where what you'd been researching was, well, here's actually how the world's working now. And then it was like, well, but that's not my experience at all. What are some of the big impacts that you've seen as you look at, and I've got my own point of view on some of the things as I've looked at this, but I'm actually curious as you look at the data and the conversations you've had, how have you seen kind of the digital era affect racism and just even the way people deal with it?
Yeah, I think so. Beyond this, so first of all, I'll say beyond this website, that there are lots of ways that racism unmasks, or excuse me, that technology can unmask racism. And I say unmask, I talk about in the book, I talk about masked racism as being the racism that is hidden or embedded in everyday friendly interactions, policies or laws that are on a surface level race neutral. They're not explicitly racist, but they have a racist effect in that they further racial inequality, and how racism is often masked in those ways that people who don't know how to look past the mask don't see it. Lots of people don't see that our criminal justice policies are racist because they don't understand how, oh, black folks are, stopped by the police more, and when they're stopped, they're more likely to get charged for the same, behaviors, and once they're in front of a judge, they get longer sentences for the same crimes. And you look at all these things, and we can say definitively by the evidence that the criminal justice system is racist, but it's racism under a mask, and everyone doesn't see it. And I think that the internet can unmask racism and reveal to people the ways that racism works, right? Think about this video of the black guy who was bird watching, and a white woman is now screaming into the phone, he's trying to hurt me, and calling the police. If there wasn't a video there, the police respond to that call, and that dude's in trouble. Right? How many times?
Yeah, it becomes infinitely more difficult to deal with because it's okay, now we got to try and navigate it. And depending on who the individuals are who lean into it, you might have a radically different experience.
Exactly.
One might just take it super seriously, and one might just dismiss the whole thing.
Exactly. Right. And I think, right, things with police violence, if there wasn't a video, how do white folks know that police violence against black people happens? I think that, right, as someone growing up, I knew lots of people who experienced violence at the hands of the police, right, in my life. And it was just a normal thing that everyone knew happened pretty often. And with social media, now these videos have gone viral, and now the world has woken up a little bit to see, like, oh, yeah, that person clearly was not reaching for a weapon. They were unarmed. Why were they shot?
Yeah.
And they, right, the videos force people to come to terms with the fact that racism is real and exists. So I think that's the first answer to the question, is that the internet or technology can unmask racism.
We've democratized a lot of this stuff that before just you didn't even have access to.
Right. Exactly. Now, on the other side of that, I think that the technology changes how we resist racism. And part of racism being more visible in online spaces, it means it's easier to highlight and to target and to attack. It's easier to talk about. It's easier to prove with the link. And so one of the things I talk about in the book.
Yeah. So when somebody goes, that's not true, that doesn't happen, it's like, well, here you go.
Here's a link. Exactly. Right. So I'm thinking about the research on racial microaggressions, right? There's been hundreds of papers on experiences with racial slights. The research says that the most common way to respond to racial microaggressions is just to not respond. So most of the time when folks of color experience subtle racial slights, things that question our appearance, our behavior, our criminality, right, or labeling us criminals in public spaces and when we shouldn't be, that these things are normal and happen every day. And most of the time people just don't respond to them. So that means when we don't respond, it's like we're accepting this as being natural, as being normal. And the people who commit microaggressions, whether intentionally or unintentionally, are just going to do it again because they've never been challenged. No one has ever told them that that
Yeah.
behavior is
Nobody's ever
problematic.
said, "Hey, did you even see what just happened right there?"
Exactly, right? And, when I talk with students about this, and this is something that was unexpected, I didn't go into the study trying to understand how people responded to racism, but what I found is that students felt more comfortable and were more likely to either see or personally get involved in challenging racism online and through social media than they were in person. That online, when someone makes a racist joke, instead of it just being uncomfortable and you look around and then tell some, friends of color later on, like, man, you won't believe what so and so said, that someone always says something to that joke. That I had, right, one of black men I talked to gave me an example of a racist joke where a white woman posted online saying, hey, I'm walking behind this black guy on campus, how ironic would it be if I robbed him for his iPhone? And then, right, someone posted on the comment, well, why would that be ironic? Are you saying you expect a black person to rob you? So this tiny little racist joke that
Okay.
would
Which
typically
would have just
go
gone completely off the radar, or to your point, maybe people might have been like, "Ugh, not appropriate," but not done anything about it. Now, because
exactly,
it's out there, there's the opportunity to actually lean in and go, "Let me challenge what you just said right there."
exactly, right. And they challenged this comment, and the student told me, he said, there's never been an incident where someone has made a comment like that online where someone doesn't say something to it. Right? Usually, when
Really?
we think about
Okay.
microaggression, one of the right the reasons why we don't respond, it happens too quickly. We aren't sure of what to say. We aren't sure whether it's racism. Right? We don't want to lose a friend by offending someone or making them think that we're too sensitive or too militant. But online, you're right that there's less pressure on any one person to respond. That when these comments are happening in public settings, that people who have the time and energy that day to respond can, and everyone doesn't have to, but everyone benefits from witnessing that
Right,
response,
because
right?
even if one person respond, I think that goes back to how the digital space is changing things. Is now that exposure is so much greater. So, and I see this just in human behavior in general. That in general, people don't like to respond to things. It's any, especially if it's uncomfortable. I mean, people don't like
Hmm.
to respond to things even if it's positive. If it's negative, it just goes way up. But now you're increasing the number of people who have opportunity to. So even though a vast majority still won't, sometimes it's that one person who does that then starts the trend, or at least now exposes everybody else to, hey, there is a different point of view on this than the one that was originally represented.
Exactly, exactly. And right, so in this example of this white woman making this joke, based on what happened online, a black activist reached out to that person and began meeting with them to help them understand what was problematic about what they said. And right, seeing that as kind of being a personal level outreach of helping her racial kind of consciousness. And then I had other students tell me that they saw this woman being, was brought to a black party later in the semester, and they saw that as being evidence of, like, she has really made an effort at changing the way that she does things, and kind of growing as a person, and then understanding how you can cause harm by something that you didn't mean to hurt anybody with. And so I think it's just a powerful change in norm, from the norm being silence to the norm being, we're going to say something when you say or do something racially problematic, in a way that is going to stop the reproduction of this idea, that is going to make sure that if you do it again, that what you're doing this next time is harmful, that right,
Yeah.
and you're making a
The first
decision.
time might be an accident. The second time, hey, this has been called out to you before. It's been addressed and you're still doing it. This is no longer just a whoops. This is you're consciously making this choice.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that right, when you ask what is the difference, what is the change that technology has brought to the ways that we discuss race and racism, one of the differences is that silence has long been the norm, that we are
Okay.
long expected to be silent and to not highlight or point out racism in mainstream settings. It's inappropriate. It makes people feel uncomfortable. People get defensive if we say that they do something that is racist. Everyone sees racist as being a bad word, right? I call it, right, like this idea of racism with the capital R. If you don't admit to being a white supremacist, then people don't think the racist label applies to you. And so by
Okay.
pointing out racism is something that, right, we're not saying that you're a bad person for the rest of your life. We're saying that you have just done harm. And I think that in online spaces, this, clapping back at racists has really changed how we experience these things, that we no longer have to be silent. We're not silenced by social norms, and instead it is becoming the norm where we can challenge and highlight and respond to racism in ways that take some of the pressure off of us, and make sure that racism is not something that is reproduced in silence, that we want people to know where it is and what it looks like so they can recognize it.
So, with this one, kind of balancing some of the things you talked about, I think are really relevant. And two that I want to go back to and revisit and just kind of express or unpack how you've navigated this. One of the things that I think one of the pros to technology has done is it's exposed us to a much broader scale of things. I mean, again, I just even think of seeing what's going on in the world. We have access to see things going on in the world that we didn't know even existed before. And now we actually, again, can be exposed to it. That can have a negative effect in that we can start to, and I think of an example that I deal with when it comes to corruption in the church, okay, as an example. There's a lot more exposure to that. And one of the downsides has been it can lead people to come to the conclusion, well, now it's everywhere and everywhere. And it's like, well, maybe, and yes, we need to watch for that. How have you seen potentially mitigating the negative impact that can have?
The negative impact meaning people seeing corruption as being universal when it is exposed.
No, not so much in that sense, but that it doesn't have a negative influence on you where you can almost over index on jumping to conclusions. And I see this
Mm.
because there's
Mhm.
some personal examples in my life where assumptions, and I think the way you talked about it is a really positive way where how do you avoid going to that, where it's actually having a human interaction with the person and trying to understand, like, hey, were you aware, like, what did you do with this? But sometimes that can be difficult in the digital world because it's so ambiguous. They're like, well, I don't really know who that person is, to be able to have that one-on-one conversation.
So just to make sure I got you here, it sounds like
Yeah,
you're saying, how do we make sure that we don't go take this too far,
correct.
and when something comes out that we vilify someone before all the information is there? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah,
That
exactly.
that's a difficult thing. Now, so my take on that is that the norm is for these things to happen in silence, and when people violently respond to accusations about someone being racist or sexist, homophobic, or engaging in some inappropriate behavior, right? When we're talking about kind of
Yep.
church corruption and things like that. Um, I think that that you have to understand that this is happening in the context of, typically this is going to be dealt with internally, and there will never be a response or a consequence for those folks who are involved.
Yeah.
And so I think that I see, right, like when I look at the responses that are going over the top, they're going over the top because there have been decades of them not being able to say anything. And I
Yeah.
see the, right, like even, right, do I think that we need to gather information before we, take action? Yes, I do. But I think that we should not be more sensitive to people reacting quickly and being loud about it than we are to people reacting too
Yeah.
slowly and being quiet about it, because that has been the real villain,
That's been,
right?
well, and I think to your point, that's been the history of things. And so saying, hey, like, and I agree with you, we shouldn't slow progress because we're like, well, there's the possibility it could go too far. It's like, well, no,
Yeah, yeah,
that's not a productive outcome, while at the same time being mindful of it.
yeah, yeah. Now, what I would love to see is, right, because part of this is, online consequences don't always lead to real world consequences.
Right.
Sometimes they do. Some people will lose a job, or, right, like sometimes things happen, but often they don't. And what I would love to see is some kind of restorative justice approach, where, right, this doesn't, right, like if you're being called out for something problematic, does that mean that you should never work again? Does it mean that you should never be able to
Right.
have a job again? Does it mean that you should lose everything that you have? You know, I'm not going to say that yes or no, but I'm going to say that I would love to see a community restorative justice process where the, you know folks who are involved, folks who are hurt, people who have long, people who have experience with restorative justice, and in thinking differently about what punishment should look like in society, are sitting down and figuring out, okay, how do we fix the harm that was caused by this incident? And I would love to see things like that, where, right, what does it look like for for someone who um, does something racist, to work with anti-racist groups at learning at what they've, like, where they went wrong, and then working to undo the harms that they have caused, whether that's structurally or on a kind of interpersonal basis. And so I would love to see there be a offline restorative justice process attached to online calling out of problematic behaviors and
I
actions.
like that.
Um,
Okay.
and I and I think that there are examples of people who do things like that, but right, like, and there's lots of examples of restorative justice processes that are successful. But I don't know that we have a systematic way of connecting online calling out of problematic things to, okay, how does that lead to real world change, beyond just kind of burning this person at the public stake, on social media, to, right, how do we fix this issue? And right, because the reality is, you throw one racist away, and there's going to be two more that pop up, and right, we
Well,
got
because
to
in
have
some
a.
ways it almost fuel and that's, I think, the part that we have to be so mindful of, is it can almost fuel it, like you said, because people see that, oh, well, they were burned at the stake, so now I'm more defensive of that. And but I think the point, something I would just add, that I would clarify in case it came out differently than intended, is I completely agree with the fact that there is a natural defensiveness that comes up when somebody even questions or asks about anything you did. I
Mhm.
mean, I've been married 15 years, right? I could just even think of my marriage. That happens where your spouse asks a question, even maybe well intended, but because you know that maybe wasn't your intent, or maybe you just didn't even realize it, defenses fly up. And the natural tendency is to want to fight back instead of go, let me lean in and understand, like, where did that question come from? Help me understand why you're asking. And again, to your point of, where sometimes, yeah, maybe somebody did light you up for something that you really weren't intending on doing, but instead of reacting back to that, that's not going to be productive either, because now you're just going to end up in this heated debate over this, versus leaning in and trying to understand, hey, what did I do, or what did I give the impression of doing that struck a chord?
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And this, right, I mentioned this a little bit, but this goes back to how we define racism. That if people define racism as being an open white supremacist, then that means any accusation of racism, however subtle, is going to be met with all the defensiveness of folks who are like, I don't hate. I am not, right. I don't hate black people. Don't call me a
Right.
racist. And it's like, right, but when really what you want to tell them is, you don't have to hate someone to ask them
Right.
for their ID on campus, when you're not asking white folks for their ID on
Right.
campus. Right? There's no hate behind that action. That is a unintentional, like, this kind of, you've internalized these racist stereotypes, and right, this is something that we need to unpack and understand how it's causing harm without you hating someone. And so I think
Yes.
that part of having these conversations is getting people to have a more complex understanding of what racism is. It's not just someone who hates all groups of color. It's someone who has an attitude that legitimates or supports racial inequality. And it's completely possible to have racist ideas
Yeah.
without being someone who feels any hostility or anger towards communities of color. And the more people understand, right? So when we want to challenge racism, when we want to challenge racial microaggressions, instead of taking that personally, like, oh, I'm a bad person, and if I admit
Right.
to this, it means that I am horrible for the rest of my life. No, it means that, right, I think, it means that there is something, and I'm forgetting the guy's name who did this analogy, that there's something in your teeth, and you need to get it out of your teeth. Right? It's not a
Yeah.
This is not who you are, but there's something in
Right.
your teeth.
It's not
So let's
it's
get.
not an address of your identity. I'm simply saying, you ate a salad and there's a piece of spinach in your teeth. I'm just making you
Exactly.
aware of it so you can floss it out.
Exactly. And if we adopt that mentality, then you can say, "Oh, thank you for telling me that I had something in my teeth. Let me get rid of this racism and be the person that I want to be, which is someone who thinks racism is bad." Right. And so that's why this is why unmasking
Yeah.
racism is so important, that lots and lots of people don't see racism in all the places that it lives. And by showing them where it lives, right, I think we live in a country where most folks in the United States would see racism as being bad. They just don't understand how everyday life, is filled with racism, how everyday laws are filled with racism, how Black folks' lives now are, influenced by racism without it ever, making itself visible. And so
Yeah.
we
Sometimes
have,
even into the public eye.
exactly, exactly.
So, on the technology front, I am curious how you see the shift in technology and really more our adoption of technology. How has that affected what you just talked about right there? Because I think it's a spot on point where, sometimes things have been created and this goes back to, I think sometimes we're talking with two different definitions. And so when you're saying, "Hey, I'm talking about racism," someone else is going, "Oh, I know what that is, and that's this." And so if you're saying that, then you're saying this. Is like we're not even using the same words. How have you seen technology affect that, either positively or negative, in terms of coming to a better understanding that, hey, when we're talking about this, we're talking about, yes, there's times we're talking about these extreme examples, but sometimes we're just talking about you've got a piece of spinach in your teeth
Yeah.
so that it reduces that flare.
That is a great question. So I talked about doing all the interviews for the book. What I also did is I have millions of tweets gathered over, looking at a decade of trends and different,
Yeah.
word usage on social media. And what I'm trying to do is understand, how has our discussion and our language about race changed over time.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found that is huge growth in things like structural racism. The more people are
Yeah.
talking about what it means to structural racism, if you understand that racism is not just one person hating another on an individual level, but it's also the way that our structures, our institutions, our policies are, right, have racist impact, or create racial inequality, then you understand that how racism continues without people hating each other. Right? Things talking about reparation, talking about abolition, that there are lots of things that have become popular through social media, that are, advancing our general understanding of racism. So a term like microaggressions, something that was developed in the 70s by a Black psychiatrist, and then now, right, like, and then over the past couple decades, Daryl Wing Sue has kind of led bringing it, back to bear through research. But this is a research and scholarly concept that has become a buzzword. Right. I have a paper where I
Yep.
found that the use of the term microaggressions has increased 8,000% over the last decade. That this is a right. More and more people know what microaggressions are, know what subtle racial slights are, largely. And right, that I would argue that a lot of it has to do with how people use these things online. That we're having these discussions and raising awareness. And in, my study of, the way that people use the term microaggressions online, around 40% of the tweets in the sample that I looked at, were anti-microaggression. They were trying to say microaggressions aren't real and that people are making much ado about nothing. But right, if even the opposition is familiar with the term, that shows that more people are
There's
becoming
greater
aware
awareness.
of this idea that
Yeah.
subtle racism is a thing. And that everyone doesn't believe that, right, like that it's as, harmful as we want to say that it is, but
Right. Or
people are
where they
more.
draw the same boundary lines on exactly where they see it. But at least it's like, yeah, but you're at least acknowledging there is a real thing that we're talking about, where before that would have just been completely, nobody even knew what that was.
Exactly. So I think that activists and educators and, folks on social media have been, finding ways to educate the public for a long time. One of my favorite articles, when I was first starting reading about these things, talked about Black bloggers during Hurricane Katrina, and how, as the mainstream news media is talking about Black folks looting stores, that Black bloggers were telling the truth, telling counter narratives about what was happening on the ground. that they're using technology to share information that was not available through the mainstream news, right?
Okay.
Yeah, right. There are other examples of things like that where folks are learning from what's online. I had one student who told me that she came into college conservative. She called herself a Stacey Dash, and said that I'm leaving, fight the power. And the thing that changed her was not anything she learned in class. It was following blogs that taught her what systemic racism was, that by finding she found online spaces and people who were engaged in right informal knowledge sharing, that were teaching people how to better understand the world as it pertains to racism and sexism in particular. That again was not universally taught in high school or college. And so I think that now when you see this kind of conservative push to remove race and race education from schools, it is in recognition of the fact that I think that we've been doing a good job of helping people understand what racism looks like through social media. So now they're trying to get rid of these things because they don't want kids to understand the real stories behind the civil rights movement, and how, right, that this wasn't something that happened on accident from just there being special people in the right place at the right time who sat down on the bus because they were tired.
Yeah.
No, it was about regular, ordinary people who were working together to build human capacity, who were organized. They don't want you to know that because that means we can get organized again, right? As opposed to just being some kind of magic that
Going back
happened to
to the
happen.
education piece playing such a huge role in actually making big, massive scale changes to things. It doesn't happen because one person's elected into office. It happens because there's massive scale changes happening by folks, but that requires people to be educated and understand the complexity of what really goes on in all of this, and not an oversimplified straw man.
Exactly, exactly. And so one of the right, I have a chapter that talks about activism, and online activism. And one of the things I found is that students who spend a lot of time making posts about racial justice issues develop activist identities. And
Okay.
there's some debate in the research about, is this real activism? Is it something that can actually create change, or are people just talking online but it doesn't affect the real world? Now we know that, so kids who share political information are more likely to vote when they're 18.
Okay.
So it does have some connection to kind of the traditional measures of political, kind of organizing or outcomes. But apart from that, one of the forms of organizing is transformative mobilization, which means you're trying to change people's minds. You want to expand their imaginations for what kind of a world is possible. And so it's like a form of organizing where you want people to understand what inequality looks like and understand how we can potentially fight it. That is part of what I see happening with online organizing, is that when we see people posting and challenging ideas that we've just taken for granted, it is expanding our capacity to understand oppression and to understand what freedom of oppression might look like. And that's something
Yeah.
that is happening on social media. So when you say, what are the things that are happening in these changes? Part of the answer is that social media is expanding our national consciousness of racism. It highlights it, it unmasks racism, and it shows us a way forward and how we can get involved and be part of the solution to this problem that before technology, many people did not know was still here.
Yeah. Well, and as you're talking about this, I think it goes back to some of these underlying beliefs we still have about technology that I think need to go, which is somehow when you do something with technology, it's not real. And that's kind of a central theme that we've seen throughout our
Mm.
conversation that I actually think is not a positive thing, because similar to like what you said, you can go, oh well, they're just posting about it online, that's an armchair quarterback type of a thing. And it's like, well, no, there is actually, that is a real thing that is affecting change. And maybe that individual, that may be the contribution they have to creating greater awareness and something like that. But maybe somebody else who sees and their mind is changed based on what they see, they may actually feel compelled to go do something different type of a thing. And so it's part of the bigger machine. And an area that I get a little feisty about this one is, I see the same thing with human relationships, where people act as though, well, human relationships aren't real if you're not in the same room together, or you've never gotten in the same room. And I'm like, that's not true. You don't understand human dynamics if you think that, well, because it's online, it's fake. It's not a real experience. It's like, no, it is a real experience. But that persistent belief that it's not, actually, many of the themes you talked about today, it can contribute to dismissing some of the stuff that is actually driving real change.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. I think that it is important for us to embrace online activism and online organizing. I think it's a powerful tool that has changed, the dynamic of online of activism. But I also think that it's not enough, and I think that we need to
Yes.
combine online efforts with real world efforts. And so all about bridging this gap, whether real or in our heads, between our online worlds and realities and our face-to-face worlds and realities, and understanding how online communication can be a tool, but is not the only tool that we need to have to create social change.
So in terms of, and I agree, I think that's just it. You can't go, well, posting on Facebook is enough. I think there's more to it than that, but I think dismissing that effort as, well, that's irrelevant and doesn't matter, I think is also a mistake.
Yeah.
But on this one, shoot, I had a question for you now regarding this. um, what was it? Well, let me ask you this in terms of when it comes to the interpersonal side. Oh, yeah, now I remember what it was. So, as you look at some of this, we talked about it earlier, and I appreciated your perspective on this in terms of like, how do we walk this line carefully, recognizing the need to balance and preserve human relationships? What is your assessment on where things are today as you look at this through the digital lens? Is some of the chaos, is some of the tension, is some of the messiness of this part of the natural order of, yeah, we're being exposed to things we haven't been exposed to before. And whenever that happens, it's messy because we're dealing with stuff that we thought, oh, well, that didn't exist. And the first time you have to deal with it, it's not super clear cut how we navigate all this. Is some of what you're seeing with this as we march through the waters we're in right now the result of, hey, we're crossing bridges we haven't had to cross before, or things we thought were behind us actually aren't behind us, and we're finally recognizing that?
Yeah, yeah. So I do talk in the book a little bit about Palestine.
Okay.
To the right when I discuss, and right there, so again, the book came out in May, so this is before what's
Yeah.
happening now, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I discuss how Black activists have long faced consequences and repercussions for speaking up in support of Palestine. From
Okay.
professors being threatened with losing tenure, Angela Davis was given an award that was rescinded. Rappers having their shows canceled when they said free Palestine, and there have long been consequences for speaking out and saying those things. There's long been one narrative in the media, and that is of Israel being under terrorist attack, right?
Okay.
And I
Yep.
think that one thing that happens on social media is that there is a different story being told, which is a story, right? That people, if you just watch the news, you will not know, right? You don't hear the word colonialism, you don't hear the word apartheid. It's just not something that is part of the national consciousness. And I think that one thing I showed is that if you look at the usage of the term Palestine on social media, it exploded a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And right with and people were posting saying, hey, like the right, they're posting videos from on the ground in Palestine where Palestinian activists are trying to get the word out there, showing like, hey, this is what's happening. They're not showing it on the news, but this is how we're suffering, and people are able to see a different side of this conflict.
Yeah.
And I think that is right, that when the media only shows one side, then that puts people in a position of not having a full understanding of what's going on. I think right now that you have a combination of, you have images from on the ground in Palestine showing what's happening. I think that right, maybe those images are going to dry up as folks don't have power and they're cutting off internet. I think I saw that Elon Musk, who said he's going to try to give satellite connection to recognized groups in Palestine. And so there are things that are
Yeah.
happening right now that are new. I think one thing that we've seen is that I have friends who, when they were posting about Palestine, posted screenshots of Instagram telling them that they would no longer be allowed to post on that topic. And right, that
Wow.
being just a right, and Instagram ended up apologizing and saying it was an accident, but we don't know that it was an accident. And I think part of what's happening is that social media has been a way for activists to bypass traditional knowledge
Yeah, the
gatekeepers of
traditional
information.
institutions of what has kind of kept this stuff in check.
Exactly, right? Like, a buddy of mine, Jacob Grosek, wrote a paper about protests in Ferguson and found that Black activists were bigger hubs for information sharing during those protests than were news outlets. So that meant that instead of Black activists having to get the attention of the journalists to say, hey, show the world what we're going through here, that they had the attention through social media, and then journalists had to follow them to find out what was going on. So that's a change in power dynamic there, right? That's
Yeah,
important. But now what we're seeing too is that the social media companies are now the new gatekeepers of information,
they're the
where they
new
can
gatekeepers.
modify. Exactly, right?
They
They can
can get, yeah.
modify the algorithms. They can make it so that your posts don't reach all the people that they're supposed to reach. They can take down accounts or posts, which are things that
Or
we're seeing happen now.
set your feed up so that you're only seeing things that it knows are already aligned to how you're already thinking about things.
Exactly. So right now we're in a place where you have, on one hand, people sharing news from on the ground and sharing counter narratives that are not consistent with what we see in mainstream media. At the same time, we have misinformation that's going around, where posts may go viral before people realize that picture is actually not of what you're saying. That picture is
Yeah.
from this, right? Like, I think I saw a post of someone showed like a person in a body bag texting, and they said, "Oh, this is Palestinians faking death for the media, and it's not really as bad as they say it is." But then someone went and found, like, that is actually a picture of a kid in Taiwan on Halloween from 2 years ago, and they found the origin, right? So it's like there are things that are happening that are
Uh,
misinformation, and it is difficult for us to process what is real, what is not, what sources can we trust, what sources can we not trust. And I think people are really struggling with that right
no,
now.
well, and I think this goes, I actually would love to kind of unpack this a little bit because to me, this is this goes back to what I was saying. I think we're in this really transitional phase, which things have shifted. The power dynamics have changed. The way we consume information is different. The accessibility to this stuff is different. And in many ways, it's really good. In many ways, it's disrupted things, and people are struggling to figure out how to navigate this. And I'm curious if that's one of the things that you're seeing through this, because I think of where we are in the AI age now, where this whole question around what can I trust anymore? And I think back to your very early example of the person who saw the website and it just made them question everything about, well, like, who can I trust now? Because what's on this website, that could be the person I'm sitting next to in class who I think is my best friend, but maybe they're not my best friend. And how technology is now creating this space where it can be, I think, overwhelming for some people to go, I don't know what to believe anymore because I don't even know if this image is real or if it was generated by AI, and how to navigate that. Because what can happen is you can end up going back into your echo chamber of, I just don't know what to do. So I'm just going to sit back and not lean into it, which is, I actually think, the worst thing that we can do.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's tough. I think that it's hard for me to have advice for what people should do, other than to tell them to um, follow known activist organizations. That,
Yeah.
right, I think that there are accounts that you can follow that will put together fact checklists, and these are right, we're right, and I think that you can find trusted information in those ways. I think, in terms of echo chambers, I've had some personal, kind of one-on-one conversations with folks based on things that they post, where I just want to kind of understand how they see the issue. Right, I think that this is a tough time. I think people are really
Yes.
invested in their opinions right now, in a way that is somewhat baffling for me. But I think that where this is a incident, or this is a situation where both sides are convinced that the other side is manufacturing lies that are tricking people.
Yeah.
And this is something that is influenced by generations of misinformation, or strategically redacted information, where not everyone has a full understanding of what's happening. I don't think that you know I think that social media has an important role in telling the counter narrative.
Yeah.
But I think that it's bigger than that, right? That there are pressures that are also preventing people from saying what they want to say. That, right, that
Yeah.
there are people's jobs are on the line. Right, like we always have people who are losing their job offers from being involved in kind of free Palestine activities. It's a it's a whole mess right now, but I think that there are a lot of folks who are you know stepping up to the plate and accepting the challenge, and trying to navigate these things. And I think there's some big, I saw kind of like there was a big kind of protest where Jews were saying "not in our name," and kind of this kind of rallying against the idea that it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israeli policy, and kind of equating a one nation with a religion that is diverse. So I think that there's a lot that's going on right now. It's difficult to navigate, um, but I think that we are seeing what we would have expected to see, which is people using social media to tell sides of a story
Stories.
that are not heard from mainstream media. And that, right,
Okay.
that is what we're seeing, and that is not all that we're seeing, right? And it's not as simple as that, but then that is what's happening, and that is, I think, part of the story of how folks have used social media to challenge racism and oppression, is that they're saying things that you're not supposed to say from an institutional kind of mainstream gatekeeper
Yeah.
perspective.
Well, and I think based on the dialogue, and you tell me if this is an accurate kind of assessment of where we've gone from a conversation standpoint, is, you know, leaning into that. And I think avoiding that reactionary response that we all can relate to that, right? You see something that challenges what you think you knew or what you thought you believed, and all of a sudden there's that natural, like, I'm just going to jump in and defend it without wanting to go, let me lean in to understand. And I think that's really the human component that technology can be used to do, is it can give you access to connect on a more human level with the people who are experiencing it, with the people, and understand what is their experience that is shaping this. What is it that they're encountering? So that you actually can understand that. Because I can just say from personal experience, there are lots of people that I built relationships with that we do not see eye to eye on plenty of different things.
Right.
But because we've leaned into the relational side and care deeply about understanding, I want to understand your experience. Help me understand that. And I think that's one of the great things technology has done, is it's democratized that, so that, going back to my echo chamber comment, you can actually get out of your echo chamber if you want to. You have more opportunity to get out of your echo chamber by saying, I can actually lean into the others that formerly I would view as others that maybe I just didn't even have access to based on where I lived or the social environments I was in or the school I attended. I may not had access to that. Now I actually do, so that I can actually start to deeply understand their experience and how that differs from mine and how I can learn from that. Doesn't necessarily mean that learning from it means you have to change everything you know about the world, but it does mean you can have a greater empathy and appreciation for the fact that your experience does not define reality.
Yeah, yeah. So I mentioned this study in the book. Um, but I did a study of Colin Kaepernick when he took a knee,
Okay.
and me and Jacob Groshek, who I mentioned earlier with the Black Lives Matter study, um, we gathered data for a week of people who were engaging in Kaepernick hate. They're burning
Okay.
jerseys, burning Nike shoes, right? Kind of in protest of Kaepernick taking a knee For folks who don't know, taking a knee in protest of anti-Black police violence. Um, and what we did is we looked for people who made concessions in a week's time, people who
Okay.
acknowledged that there was another point of view out there, who like had a
Okay.
willingness to accept another way of seeing things. And
Where it
we
was obvious
found
that that isn't what they thought before, but based on their social interactions, media consumption, they went, you know what? There's at least more to the story that I can acknowledge.
exactly. And what we found was that one of the predictors for that attitude change within a week's time is the more messages you received, the more likely you were to admit that there's another way of seeing things. You're more likely to make a concession just by the number of interactions you're having. That
Yeah.
is huge, right? Like this wasn't like we didn't conduct an intervention. We didn't construct perfect arguments. It was just by engaging in conversation, people were willing to see another point of view. I think one of
Yeah.
the things in terms of thinking about echo chambers, because we were searching data from hashtags are a way to get out of your echo chamber, because now you're talking with people who are thinking about this issue. If you use a
Yep.
excuse me, a Kaepernick hashtag, you got folks from both sides of the political
Oh,
aisle
yeah.
who are engaging in that conversation.
Right. And
And
you
so I
actually
think
get to see the arguments.
exactly. So I think that if you can get out of your echo chamber, if you can talk to people who are not in that circle of people who think like you, that there is potential for those conversations to create attitude change. But now the issue is that, again, the algorithms can make it seem as if everyone thinks the way you think and only give you, kind of information that makes you feel like the other side is crazy. And so how do we reach those folks who are kind of stuck right in the wrong side of the internet?
Yeah. Yeah. Who have for whatever reason landed on the side of, well, the AI has decided your side is the crazy side. So we're going to make sure that that's how you're represented
Yeah.
to everyone. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's just, to me, it's one of these areas that well, I'm curious if you have a take on this, but I've struggled. I've never understood with, again, what we talked about here is this leaning into both sides is actually very healthy and productive, just based on what it sounds like, the data that you showed, where it's like when people are exposed to this, it actually helps them better understand and challenge their own assumptions and come to this. And I have seen plenty of people where they actually approach that with fear, as though, like, well, I'm afraid to see the other side, because almost like, well, I'm afraid I might change my mind, which to
Mm.
me, I struggle with understanding that. To me, that's one of the best parts of technology is it does force you to think more critically. It forces you to say, well, this is what I thought, or this is what I believed before, but boy, now I'm seeing all this other stuff. It's actually forcing me to think more critically about it. Any just personal perspectives or from the data on where that comes from, and also how to overcome some of that?
So I think when we think about racial ideologies, right? An ideology is the vested way of thinking. You are invested in a particular way of thinking. Part of your
Yep.
identity, your understanding of the world comes from this way of thinking. And when people have an ideology, data and proof is not enough to get them out of it.
No.
And that is a difficulty in some of these conversations, is that people have a vested interest in a way of thinking, and they are not necessarily going to change their mind when you are introducing new information that causes them to question their reality or question some of the material benefits that they have, right? That they need to believe this certain thing in order to justify, things in their life. So I think that is a a difficulty, is there are some people who are just not going to change their minds, and
There's
no
too much
amount
at
of
stake.
data. There's too much at stake, right? If
Yeah.
you convince someone that white privilege is real, that means that they have to accept that everything they have, they did not work hard for. And that, right? Like
Right.
the feeling of, no, I have these benefits because I am a hardworking, good person, and that the people who live in poverty did not work as hard as I did. If you break that
Right.
down, then that means that they are now going to have a loss of a sense of self that they're going to, right? And that can be
Yeah.
something
It
that is hard
challenges
for
your own
people.
personal identity, which I think can be terrifying for people.
Exactly, exactly, right. And I think that that is something that is difficult for people to learn, right? Is right. Like, I'm someone who, like, all right, so I'm black, but I'm also a straight man. And so for me to recognize that there are, right, like, there homophobia lives in places that I have not had to think about for most of my life. That,
Yeah.
right, like I have not recognized for most of my life how being a man, you know, gives me, right, actually, right, makes my life easier in ways that I don't think about until I, had to be intentional about learning about, what sexism is, what is
Yeah.
the patriarchy, and how I benefit. It's difficult for people to recognize the ways that they are advantaged and to realize that everything you have is not just because you're so awesome. It's also in part because of these kind of systems of oppression, and that if you are on the dominant side, that right, that gives you benefits you didn't earn. So it's tough. It's tough, and I think
Yeah.
that, part of my kind of post research, or excuse me, post book work and research is about building film-based interventions that help people better understand what racism looks like, and feel better equipped to be able to challenge racism. And so I do see this as being something where, like, look, I've done the research. Right, if you read When the Hood Comes Off, there's a lot more information about the things that we've been talking about. But then, what I'm also trying to do is do the work to put tools out there that can help people better understand these things, and become part of the solution instead of being part of the problem.
Well, and as we kind of wrap this up, I think it's a great point to land on as we kind of wrap this, is the fact that, again, the technology and everything we've discussed so far is it's opening up new and different channels to give people exposure to some of this stuff, which I get it can be frightening, sure, but I mean, you don't get in shape by not working out as much as you'd like to, by going, I really want to be in shape. I just really don't ever want to lift a weight. It's like, well, you kind of have to do the hard work with that. But I think what technology does is it opens up new channels and new avenues for people to expose that, where historically it was like, well, you only had these channels and that was it. And if you didn't have exposure to that, there was no way to ever grow. And I think the democratization of that is huge, even though it can be very messy. And I think we've unpacked some of the messiness of it, while at the same time saying, but we shouldn't be afraid of that.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And I think, in by and large, the democratization of information online is a positive. I think that it
Yeah.
means the people, right. And just quickly, I know that we're
No, we're
coming up on
good.
the end of. Oh, we're good. Okay, good, good. So, right, I will say that one of the things I talk about in the book is the difference in how activists have to think about the media. That during the civil rights movement, activists had to strategize, how do we get the media's attention on our protest? That there was one of the strategies for
Yeah.
nonviolent protest was this belief that people are good. That if you show people the ugliness of racism, they're going to be on your side and want to take down racism. So they wanted the cameras to be on when the dogs were attacking, when the police were attacking. And they, right, because they believe that the
Yeah.
American people will say,
And people would see
we don't
that and
want.
go, that's not okay.
Exactly. This is not consistent with who we are as Americans. But journalists didn't always want to show those things. That
Yeah.
it was hard work to figure out, how do we force them to have to show some of this, right? It was difficult. Nowadays, right, activists don't have to necessarily force the hand of journalists, because we can make something go viral on our own. And that means that we're not waiting around for the media to decide that this is a story worth telling, that we have our own, right, ways of sharing
Yeah.
counter narratives that challenge the dominant ways of thinking. Now, again, these could be in danger as the algorithms
Sure.
make it more difficult for folks to share those counter narratives. But I think that that is something that has been overarching, a positive, that is really, making it so that, that we are no, or again, this goes back to how students feel, that we are no longer silenced. We no longer need to ask permission to get a platform to share counter narrative information. And instead, we have the power to share things and to learn things that are not being taught in schools, right? So I think that lots of people are acting in the absence, right? Where institutions didn't show up. So in the absence of colleges and universities, you know, finding ways to stop microaggressions in the classroom, students of color are finding
People
ways to
took it
do it
into
on
their
their.
own hands.
Exactly. And I think we're seeing that with activism and absence of the news sharing objective information that shows both sides of an issue. People on social media are saying, oh, we're going to show you proof that we're going to retweet this activist who's in Palestine taking cell phone videos. So now you can see what the media won't show you. Some of the things you're talking about, right? With churches, an absence of churches holding folks accountable for problematic things,
Right.
that you have people who are saying, "Oh, we are going to expose the church for doing these things," and demand a different type of institutional response moving forward. So I think I think it's up to the institutions to respond and to prove that they really are about the positive things that they espouse by implementing some of these types of strategies for stopping problematic behaviors.
Well, and I think what's interesting about it is there can be the reaction to say, well, but it could go wrong. And it's like, well, yeah, but that happens all the time in life anyway. The overall overarching good that comes from it outweighs that. And I think the part that's uncomfortable for a lot of institutions and individuals is there's greater accountability. And I think that's one of the things that is difficult for people. I mean, I just see that in organizations and being in leadership positions that accountability is really tough, and people are fine with things changing so long as they're not actually accountable for it. And I think that's what we're seeing with technology is there's greater accountability. You can't just do things and then just pretend it didn't happen. It's like, well, you did it. It's out there.
Right.
Everybody knows. So you have to be prepared to explain yourself or defend what happened. And I get, sure, sometimes you might get things go off the rails or somebody wrongly gets burned at the stake. Okay, but that's been happening for a long time. And I think the greater good that's coming from this vastly outweighs the risks.
That's right. That's right. I agree.
Well, Rob, this has been a delightful conversation. I really appreciate you being here and spending time with me and just engaging in this. And again, I hope people are able to lean into, yes, it's messy, it's changing, it's uncomfortable. There may be things that are changing or forcing you to think differently about things. And that can be scary, but overall, it can be good. So thank you so much, Rob, for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate you, taking the time for us to be able to make space to talk about, these issues in this book.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And everybody, show notes will have all the different links to things. We will see you at the next one.